Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 330th New Social Environment. I'm Jess Chen, Events Assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Hashim Sarkis and Paul D. Miller. We're also thrilled to have the poet Jorie Graham here, who will read today to close today's program. We've started all of our events with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. The heart of both of these acknowledgements is a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and solidarity for all who struggle for freedom, and recognition that when it comes to liberation, our histories never unfold in isolation. In that spirit, I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Architect, educator, and scholar Hashim Sarkis is the principal of Hashim Sarkis Studios, established in 1998 with offices in Boston and Beirut. He is also the Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology since 2015, and was the curator of the 17th International Architecture Exhibition at the 2021 Venice Biennale. He is joined by composer, multimedia artist, and writer Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky, who immerses audiences in a blend of genres, global culture, and environmental and social issues. Miller has collaborated with an array of recording artists, including Metallica, Chuck D, Steve Reich, and Yoko Ono, and he is an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. Paul, take it away.
Hey everyone, and Jess, thank you so much for your introduction, and greetings to Nick, Fong, Catherine, and the whole Brooklyn Rail crew. I am dialing into this conversation from about 2 hours north of New York, near an area called Rhinebeck, near Hudson and Pleasant Valley. I just want to also say thank you to Hashim for joining us. This is, statistically speaking, this is one of the hottest summers in human history, and welcome to the Anthropocene era. We have a delightful guest in the form of Hashim Sarkis today, and his experiences at MIT teaching various friends and colleagues of mine, like Mitchell Joachim, who does Terraform One, and just want to say they're a great group of architects that Hashim has raised up over the years. So Hashim, hey, hi, good to see you. And thank you so much for joining us. I have so many questions. First and foremost, how are you? You're in Boston.
I'm very good. I'm for the first day since March 2020 in my office at MIT. Mm-hmm. The books were still there. They say hello. It's good to be back. So thank you for a whole set of circumstances that brought me back to my office at MIT. Thanks to Mitch for introducing us and bringing us together. And truly honored to be with you, Paul, and to also have Jorie Graham be our guest poet today. Jorie, I'm so honored and grateful for you to accept this on such short notice. You don't know how much influence your poetry has had on me throughout the years and how present your poetry is at the Venice Biennale. So thank you very much for coming.
And thank you, Jorie, as well. Okay, wow. So here we are, Hashim. This is probably the perfect summer to reflect on many of the issues that drove the thematics of how do we live together, which is your curated sort of curatorial aesthetic foundation for the Biennial. Before we get into that, I want to ask you a couple questions about your biography and background in life. Obviously, you have come from the Middle East, Beirut, Lebanon, and then find yourself at MIT, which is, one could argue, one of the most opposite things you could probably think of, if one believes in opposites, come to think of it. But how did you come to be here? And I would love to hear some of your thoughts about where you studied and what began your obsession with the combining philosophy and architecture. Sorry if I'm calling it an obsession, but I think you have a passion for philosophy.
Well, as you said, I'm from Beirut. I was born and raised in Beirut. In a house that my father had commissioned a friend of his, an architect in Beirut, to design. Very beautiful little house with a garden and courtyard and inside and outside blended in. I think ever since I was a kid, friends would come and admire this tiny but beautiful modern house. And I think I became jealous of the architect. And at the age of 3, I decided to be an architect to do something like that. Little did I know back then what it was, and I don't think I know much more today what it is. But I feel like that is what anchored me in architecture, to be born in it rather than to acquire it later on. So I ended up studying architecture at the American University of Beirut, but because of the continuing war, which started while I was in high school, I had to leave, and I transferred to the Rhode Island School of Design, which only strengthened my passion for architecture. And then the war kept going on, so I kept studying. I couldn't go back. So I did a master's at Harvard, then a PhD, and then I taught at Harvard for about 20 years, which is when I met Jorie. And then 6 years ago, I moved to MIT. And in the meantime, I also established my own architecture practice, which kept taking me back to Beirut. It's between Cambridge and Beirut. And the rest is what you described in your very elegant introduction.
Well, okay, from Cambridge to Beirut and back again. I love it. There's got to be, I mean, when we were talking earlier about some of the issues driving the pandemic pivot, because you guys had to, the biennial was initially supposed to happen last year. And I remember you mentioned that you felt that it gave you some more breathing room and to have a fine tuning of many of the aesthetic issues that drove the biennial. Let's start there, because it's not every day that you can pivot and have a biennial be, pushed back. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that beginning initiative and then how it came to be pushed back, if you don't mind. It's just a little, I want the audience to kind of get a sense of some of the behind the scenes, if we lift up the hood, so to speak, how it all happened.
It's a very helpful question. I haven't been asked this question of under the hood before, because I feel the world must know how challenging it was, not just for me, but especially for the participants, to find themselves February 2020, a few months before the opening, in front of the pandemic and not knowing what they're going to do. First, they were in the middle of preparing their projects, and then all of a sudden, they not only had to lock themselves up, they had to rethink their practices, because many of the participants are young practices and therefore quite vulnerable to what happened. Many of them had to shut down, lay off people, relocate. And then many of them also lost their sponsors. Many of the architectural participants need sponsors to support their projects. The Biennale helps a little bit, but not much. And so we had to shut down, basically, like the whole world, we stopped. And then only when we got a better sense that May 2021 seemed like a likelihood, we started the conversation again. And that conversation proved to be amazing, truly amazing, because we took the question of, should we change the Biennale theme or content to reflect the present conditions back to the 115 participants? And they came back with a kind of almost unanimous response saying, no. The question, how will we live together, is a very valid question, especially more valid now, even though it comes with certain ironic tone. But ultimately, we all felt, and that's what I built into the curatorial strategy, that the main reasons behind us asking the question, how will we live together? Climate change, polarization in politics, growing economic inequalities, mass migration. These are the reasons we asked the question. And because we were not getting satisfactory answers from other spaces, we thought, why not ask it for architecture? These are the reasons that led to the pandemic. And the pandemic may hopefully soon be behind us. But if we don't address those deeper questions, we're going to be in the same mess again and again in different forms. So everybody felt it's imperative on us to stay the course. And obviously, the public that is coming to the Biennale now is looking at it with different eyes, with eyes that can measure what is 6 feet versus 8 feet. Public that can understand much better the relationship between the digital and the real. And the public that is really hungry for experiential activity rather than everything being behind the screen. So if there's anything that has happened in this Biennale, both from the participants, but also from me and the curatorial team, is that we have amplified the experiential dimension of this Biennale.
Well, I mean, that's what's a beautiful thing about the way that you guys, first and foremost, I salute the fact that you guys really stuck in there and made sure that the biennial was able to evolve and not be canceled, because and the whole, I mean, to use a highly charged term, cancel culture these days, but a lot of events and, you know, symphonies, concerts, things that were performative based really got smashed. And of course, if you look at the economy, especially the creative economy, many artists and architecture firms are highly impacted by the basic fact that we had a microorganism that we're still not quite sure where it came from, but the microorganism, you know, the virus brought the entire global capitalist structure to its knees for a period of time that was unprecedented in the modern economy, especially if you look at the 1918 pandemic. And Hashim, one thing that really blew me away about the theme, how do we live together, especially given that you have a very deeply lyrical quality, and I'm so glad that Jorie Graham is able to join us, but the lyrical quality of how do we live together cuts against the grain of things like the rise of authoritarian regimes, vaccine nationalism, and the corporate colonization of the idea of social good. You know, we live in an era now of what a lot of people are calling virtue signaling. In the US, we've been having a situation where corporations, for example, said they support Black Lives Matter, but then they weren't donating to Republican candidates after the January 6th insurrection. Long story short, to me, I don't view your show as utopian. I actually view it as quite practical and giving us better critical tools for thinking about place and person. Because social space has been under a serious attack right now, mainly from the viewpoint of, on one hand, you have right-wing ideologies of authoritarian regimes that are denying the virus and denying science. And public space has been a highly contested battlefield for that. But your theme of how you live together really, I think, cuts through the chase of all of that and creates this idea that community is the most powerful ways to recover. And I'd love to get your thoughts. Do you consider yourself a utopianist, a practice, a sort of inheritor of John Rawls? Because I know you're into Rawls. Equality was very major issue in some of the thinking about the climate crisis as well.
Paul, there are many questions in your question, and I will try to address them as I speak. Or, Paul, you are slightly Paul frozen. Do others see him frozen? Yeah. But let me try to continue, hoping that he will come back. Paul, when you choose a profession like architecture, you do condemn yourself to a level of optimism. We make things, we build. We invest a lot of resources in architecture, even though some of those resources are dubious in terms of their origin, in terms of their impact on climate. But we have no other way but to make things, and in making there's a level of optimism. Obviously, it's an optimism that hopefully is responsible, hopefully has a dose of realism in it. But let's not forget that I'm only the curator of the Biennale, not the author of all the projects. And therefore, I found it important to include in the Biennale the whole range of different approaches and therefore different degrees of realism and applicability to architecture or through architecture. I do have to say that I did exercise a prejudice, which is the prejudice of having become a little bit disenchanted, if not sick of dystopias. We've had enough of them, and we've lived through one of them recently. And I do feel like it is imperative on us to start imagining alternatives. And when we ask the question, how will we live together? The hope was that there will be no single source, no authoritarian regime, or no dictating ideology that will tell us how will we live together, but that there will be 115 viable options coming from the different architects to say, how about this? How about that? What if this? What if that? Because architecture has a way not of making space better, not only of making spaces better for people to live better, to gather better, but also to propose alternatives, to say it could be otherwise. You enter a building, you enter a different world. You go out of a building into another building, it's another world, a slightly different world. So architecture has a way of constructing alternatives. You want to call them utopian, some of them are. You want to call them hyper-realistic, some of them are. But I don't think any architect would want you to go into a space which is dystopian. So I feel like our profession has that responsibility of proposing optimistic, better worlds.
Hashim, Paul is connecting to another more stable source. So maybe now would be a good time. I could bring up some of the images if you'd like to maybe talk about some of them.
That would be great. What we agreed with Nick and Paul is that we brought a few pictures of the Biennale and wanted to share them with you just as a kind of amuse-bouche, warm up, so hopefully you can come and see it. The question, the Biennale's theme is a question: how will we live together? And the way the spaces are organized is that we've divided the exhibition into 5 scales. It starts with among diverse beings, which is how do we live together and how will we live together with other beings, but also with ourselves as having been transformed. Our bodies are now full of prosthetics, dependent on devices. We're all cyborgs. We have become much more aware of the other beings that exist within us, microbiomes, but also around us. And if we are to live together better, we have to live with other species in a different way, respect them and include them. So many of the projects like this one imagine a kind of post-Anthropocene world where to the banquet are invited other species. And so this is a kind of banquet for us in a flooded Venice, along with many other species gathered around us. There are some projects that are in this section looking at how do we invent prosthetics for the future, like this particular project. Some of the prosthetics are and devices are a little bit ironic, but they still anticipate a kind of near future where we'll be relying on devices that help us dream better, that help us chew better, that measure every aspect of our interior so that we become in full control of our bodies. But it is a changed body that will then change the spaces around it. It's the most important impact on our space is our perception of the space. These are bird cages that become bird houses, but that begin to bring people and birds together in a different way, a kind of reconnecting with the birds by a group between Rotterdam and Italy, Studio Ossidiana. This is a house imagined by a group called Maib, made out of both earth and technology, mud, fungi, fed and monitored by a very complex computer system and a robot arm that monitors the movement of the fungi, that helps sculpt the spaces in the mud. So the earth and technology work together to create this future household. This is a kind of strongly experiential sound, music, and kind of recreation of the interior of this mind. That is by Philip Beasley and a group of sound artists as well. And here again, the idea of the together in the Biennale is that we invited other practitioners and professionals to come to work with us and to elevate the fact that architecture is a convening art, is a convening practice, which is synthetic of many inputs together. This is a group from Norway that imagined the future household. Now we're in the section of new households. The composition of the household has changed, but we still design as if every household is a single family with a kid or two, whereas less than 30% of families or households are composed that way. So why is that ideology dominant? So this group imagines the cocoon as being a space for reflecting, reconnecting, both with oneself but with the world, and then from the cocoon you step back out. There are houses that are using materials that are biological materials. This is a house designed by David Benjamin and group in New York, made out of loofahs, but also bacterial organisms that help well connect and also keep the house alive. So the idea of a living house, there's Paul, he's back. Paul, we're using that time to just go over some of the projects in the Biennale. So now we're in the section of new households. And the reimagination of the household is imperative in thinking about the future of how will we live together. And this is a whole room in the section as new households that is dedicated to the apartment building. I read somewhere that a city is when two houses share a wall. And the apartment building is the epitome of living together, sharing walls and floors, but also readjusting our lifestyle in order to accommodate others. And here we opened it up to apartment building typologies from around the world. And you'll see the varieties of the kinds of spaces people share versus keep it private, and how that has been evolving, especially in the last 10 years, with cooperatives, with new materials that allow for very different layouts, to very insular apartments, people living alone. The apartment building as a place of sharing many things, starting with the wall. This is one of the
by the way, can you hear me okay? I just want to make sure.
Now I can please don't freeze on us again.
Yeah, it's the signal is dropping in and out. Yeah. Huh.
Are you able
yeah, I can hear you. It keeps dropping in and out. I'm gonna walk inside. Hopefully that'll be a better signal.
Take your time.
Yeah, I think maybe we can just keep going through some images while we get Paul to a better connection.
Next image.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Next image. So this is the section of the apartment building where you see some of the different typologies of apartments being experimented on. And one of the factors that we're looking at in this project, in this room, is density. How does one achieve density in cities? Because density means compactness, means a lighter footprint on the earth. But obviously the pandemic has challenged that idea of density, because what people were seeking during this period is sparse living far apart from each other. But there's a lot to be said to the fact that living together under these emergency situations has helped a lot of people support each other and complement each other's skills, needs in this kind of collective living. So I advocate completely that, yes, on the surface, the pandemic may have pushed us apart, but it has also pushed us together in quite beautiful ways. These are the birds again. This is an amazing machine by Lucy McRae, which is a machine to hug yourself. It kind of gives you a very, very intense hug. And here again, it's man and machine, human and machine, trying to create a kind of emotive relationship. There's a kind of emotive dimension to this whole Biennale, from a sense of love to the sense of respect, to the sense of curiosity and universality that matches the different scales. Again, different examples of collective living. These are cooperatives from Barcelona, public spaces in favelas in Venezuela, inflatable school in Berlin. And this section is really looking at how, in the process of building communal facilities, community emerges. Therefore, as you are creating a school, you articulate as a community the values that you have together on what a school is, what education is, and what the future is. As you're defining public spaces, like this favela project in Venezuela on the left, you pick up the rhizomatic herbs that grew spontaneously, and you elevate those, you turn those into your landscape in a very dignified way. Very minor intervention that really turns the favela's narrow staircases into dignified public spaces. Next. That's a beautiful bridge by Michael Monson in LA, which bridges over the train tracks in the downtown of the city. And in doing that, creates a public space. The bridge itself is like a park, and the grounds underneath also, but it also connects the disenfranchised communities to the city center. And here again, architecture as a form of social equipment. This is a structure by Luis Rojo and Begonia Fernandez show from Madrid that imagines how in the section of the household, refugees, tourists, and citizens can cohabit, can live in the same house, and creating this kind of experiential account of this coexistence and encounters among strangers, but within the space of the household.
Paul, it looked like you might be set up. Do you want to say something so that we can check your audio?
Yeah, hey, can you guys hear me okay? I had to, sorry about that. I was, the signal, I was outside, I walked in, and Hashim, I caught most of, I would say about 90% of what you were saying. It was just, is this better signal now?
We hear you very well, Paul.
Okay, cool, sorry about that.
This is a section of the household, and the structure at the end is a movable wood screen designed by Alexia Leon and Lucio Marcel from Peru, which is a very interactive surface that actually this kind of expression of the facade can itself be shaped by the users. And as you want more light, more privacy, you change it with your own hands, and you create a very different image to the outside world. And this section actually is a room called Tectonics of Inhabitation, which looks at new materials, new assembly systems like wood, carbon fiber, as being materials that will help us rethink the very nature of dwelling in the household. And very much like concrete or steel reinvented the space of the interior, there's an aspiration here to imagine how new materials, firstly, materials that are light in terms of their carbon footprint, can help us rethink the nature of the household. These are the beautiful staircases by Elisa Silva from Venezuela.
So Hashim, I had a couple of quick questions, and thank you for walking us through the exhibition. One of the things that really comes to mind is the power of the invisible versus the visible in our time. And the way that, say for example, the current slide that says, financial commodification. On the other end of the spectrum, you have stuff like the social credit system in China, which is very coercive. And then on the other hand, you have stuff like facial recognition, artificial intelligence, and stuff like Autodesk and generative design, all of which are resonant with some of the themes in the exhibition. I know you just gave us a good walkthrough of some of the major artists and architects in the exhibition, but I'd love to kind of do a little bit of a pivot and talk a little bit more about your aesthetic sort of decision process, like what thematic ideas that supplemented the theme of how can we live together were part of the process. I mean, obviously stuff like the hydrocarbon economy, the attention economy, the way we're sort of the dematerialization of how we think of things like the sublime in art and architecture. These are all resonant with what you're up to as well. Go ahead.
Let me talk a little bit about the visible and the invisible, which is in a section that is not here, but a section that is very much inspired by the poetry of Jorie Graham. And it's how will we live together as one planet? One of the challenges of accepting climate change and understanding the Anthropocene problem is that we cannot see it that clearly. We cannot see the planet as one. We cannot understand the connection between our actions, our spaces, and the globe at large. And that invisibility, as you described it in relationship to certain economic and technological factors, is also a problem for us being able to address the climate problem. Now, since the 19th century, architects have been actually very actively imagining the world as one entity, as one city, as one surface, as one building, and using architectural techniques of representation, but architecture as a space where we exercise the collective imaginary to help project possibilities. We call it paper architecture, we call it visionary architecture. It's definitely architecture that will not ever be realized. But since the advent of geography and the impact that geographers have had on architecture, this idea that architecture can help make certain things visible is very present in this Biennale. And thinking of architecture as a tool of the collective imaginary is something that we've mobilized in this Biennale. So I can speak to the imagination and to the architectural imagination as a very important component here.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like, I mean, given the circumstances of being in Venice, I mean, the Arsenale was a military complex that was used to make ships, and it was an armory. And nearby, there's an area which, if the audience doesn't know, there's the Doge of Venice at a certain point gave Jews fleeing the Spanish Inquisition refuge. And so there's a street called Rua Traghetto, which is generally considered to be the first ghetto for Jewish people, not African American. We have different ones here in America. But you know, so the highly charged location as well, because that's considered one of the first major factories where ships components were made, and it was very highly charged symbolic location for the architecture as well. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there are many aspects. For those of you who might not know the grounds of the Biennale, it actually is, the show happens in two sites that are about 15 minutes apart. One is the historic Giardini, which is like a world fair where many nations have their pavilions, and then there's the central pavilion. And then the other site is the Arsenale, which was included, I think, in the 70s as part of the grounds of the Biennale. And the main building is from the Arsenale complex that Paul just described, is called the Corderia, which used to be the rope factory. And it's a very long building. And the whole length is more than a kilometer if you include also the Artilleria, which is the other part of it. And Paul, you're very right that probably the Arsenale, given its scale and the speed at which they needed to produce things, is a kind of a pre-industrial age tailorized model of production and of division of labor among different people. Let's not forget that it also was the inspiration of Dante's Hell, when he walked in and saw all of the different laborers working incessantly on one thing again and again, and the darkness and the heat that all of that generated. But if I can say one thing to the Arsenale that came to our help here, is that it is big. It's an interior that could house in other interiors, meaning ships were built inside it, as you said. So it allowed us to build one-to-one mock-ups. Many of the households that you saw were actual houses. There are a few houses, full scale, that are built there. So that scale, I think, is very important. And then the other thing that it did to this exhibition is that it did allow for us to have to scale up to it to create these experiential moments that punch back, because otherwise the space will overwhelm. So if anything, the scale of the Biennale, the Arsenale, allowed us to scale up and make the installations more powerful. But I do have to say, Paul, that every time you walk through that space, you do see, you do feel the pulse of industry, the pulse of production, the pulse of how these are perfect assembly lines. And therefore, that room that I showed, the tectonics of inhabitation, is definitely connected to the way that the Biennale, the Arsenale was conceived as being a division of parts that then get assembled.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Hashim, I mean, I want to make sure that the audience is aware that there's a theme of philosophy that runs throughout a lot of your work. The issue for me, whether you're looking at people like Paul Virilio and his idea of bunker archaeology, where he was sort of talking about the dematerialization of fortresses and the way fortress became radar and other kinds of things in his critique of dromology, or the science of speed, or the acceleration of our culture. Which philosophers, I know you're really into Rawls. Can we unpack some of that? Yeah, is he back there? I'm sure. Let's talk a little about what philosophers that inspire some of your work, because there's a whole pantheon, and I'd love to have the audience be aware of that.
Thank you for reaching into that. If I can just tie it biographically to my education, I started studying architecture at the age of 18. And even though there's a strong humanities dimension to architecture education, I always felt I had a lack of a kind of basic liberal arts education. So when I studied for my PhD, I felt like, and Harvard PhDs at the time, you had to have a minor in another field. I felt it was my moment to have my liberal arts education, my opportunity. So I studied, I did my minor for the PhD in political theory, in political philosophy. And the theme of my dissertation was Publics and Architects, how to re-engage architecture with the democracy. And I had the huge luck of working with people like Hilary Putnam, who guided me through pragmatist philosophy, particularly the work of John Dewey. And Dewey's work was seminal for me because it touched on both the political issues and the aesthetic issues and connected them together. I also had the luck of working with John Rawls, who was at the time just finishing his second book, Political Liberalism, and guided me a lot through thinking about the appearance of justice, not just the exercise of justice. He said very beautifully in one of his essays that justice is light years away from being realized, but we have the imperative, the responsibility of making every aspect of our lives appear just. And I took it very literally, because I do see architecture and urban design as being ways in which we make justice appear. We give the appearance and semblance of justice. But importantly, that moment was when I encountered the work of Roberto Mangabeira Unger, a Brazilian philosopher, politician, who's a professor at the law school at Harvard. And he became my dissertation advisor and a really major inspiration. Roberto's interview is one of the interviews that are in the Biennale space now. He's very much someone who has been of the mindset that our society is made by us and therefore we can change it. We can experiment with it. We can restructure it. We can put our aspirations in front of us and say, how can we get there? He's also of the belief that Marxism, Hegelianism were ways in which they started with this idea that society is constructed, but they wanted to find the deep structures of this construction and therefore got caught up in thinking about the structures of capitalism, the structures of evolution in history, rather than saying, well, they're all artifices. Let's try to think about how to change them. And in that sense, I strongly see his influence in my writing and my thinking, particularly because of his fascination with the idea of a radical and pluralist democracy, which he shares with also people like Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau, who I also read very closely earlier on. But perhaps for me, the strongest influence from Roberto Mangabeira Unger, which goes back to John Dewey, but also to John Keats, is the idea of negative capability. A deeply entrenched idea in the romantic vein of thinking, which says that we as human beings are infinite in our imagination and our capacity to change, but the world in front of us is finite. And this belief in human capacity to change, to resist, to transform, but also to imagine. The power of the imagination for me is a hugely important dimension. And it comes from Keats to Dewey to Unger, and hopefully to me.
Well, I mean, one of the things that really struck me when I was reading the catalog and was reading your discussions and essays was there's a motto I'd like to say that the imagination is the ultimate renewable resource. And as we think about replenishing the imagination by going to exhibitions like yours and the way you've curated it, philosophy, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about philosophy and democracy right now, and like, especially in relationship to the theme of the Biennial, how do we live together? And the crisis of democracy with misinformation and this notion that the idea of being a citizen has somehow become a crisis point, especially on the right wing. Citizenship is such a flashpoint for right-wing ideology of people like Fox News or Trump and so on, and of course the refugees and the immigrants that are destabilizing nation states' narratives of themselves. On one hand, the biennial, there's a couple of things I wanted to kind of riff on for moments. Like, what are your thoughts about the crisis of climate and refugees? Because obviously a tremendous amount of people are being displaced by, this is the hottest summer in human history. And again, we're in the middle of the pandemic. Immigrants, refugees, things like that are going to be crisis flashpoints for authoritarian regimes to use to counter democracy. And I think some of the architecture you have included can make statements on that. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Again, I do want to say that climate change, sustainability are present in every scale of this biennale. We start with the body scale to the household scale, to the community scale, to across borders, and then to the planet. But in all of them, very, very strongly present is the question of climate, which is why I'm thinking back at the reviews that the Biennale received, why the German and the Swiss reviewers, particularly from the green newspapers, were very strong, very supportive, because they saw that dimension as being perhaps not the first time, but the strongest time that the Biennale has endorsed such a, or Biennale exhibition has made that very visible in its ambitions. But I do want to address the question of refugees at different levels. I am a refugee, and I think somewhere in your life you were a refugee, a nomad, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. In this day and age, we have all left home or carried home with us on our backs, or created multiple homes, or have no home. In that sense, it makes us all, as Ulrich Beck talks about it, all cosmopolitan citizens. And I think we should live and build on that, because it allows us to be strangers everywhere we go. And the strangeness is actually an ethic, a disposition of looking at the world, not as if it belongs to us, but as an aspiration for us to be in it. But then there's the realities and the fears and the challenges of living like a refugee, and the dangers of living like a refugee. And those, as I explained in some of the projects, are very present in the projects. There are some apartment building projects that show how refugees have been accommodated on the rooftops in tents in the city of Marseille. There are some that try to show how illegal squatters and techno-savvy kids in African squatter settlements in Nairobi can cohabit. And then there are projects that are called specifically by a group from MIT, How Will We Move Together, of how entire villages have been displaced because of climate change and have to relocate in the upper hills because of the impact of drying rivers or changing in the climate on the group itself. So here again, the notion of mobility is very present in this Biennale. And that's why a lot of the architecture looks a little bit unfamiliar, a little bit different, because it is trying to accommodate to temporary conditions, to movement, and also to the hybridity of cultures. An artist by the name of Azra Akshamia, who works on cultural mobility questions, referring in some form to Stephen Greenblatt's notion of cultural mobility, does show how symbols and signs migrate and change over time, and how she tries through her architecture and art to recreate the symbolism with contemporary means, but also for migrant populations. So that the Doge's Palace facade is reinterpreted as being construction workers' suits, and Murano glasses used to create the construction hats for them, even though they are not Italian, they're coming from different cultures, and therefore she embeds into the language, the motifs of their helmets, references to their own cultures coming from the Silk Road. So the notion of migrating architectural languages is also very present in the Biennale, I wanted to say.
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, I think refugees and immigrants are going to be, I mean, even the Pfizer BioNTech, mRNA vaccine was done by a Turkish immigrant in Germany, for example. And of course, in the US, given our hyper-polarized and sort of algorithmically coercive environment of social media like Twitter, Facebook, and so on, the eerie sensibility of how right-wing media co-opts any notion of progressive narrative and then flips it around. For example, Tucker Carlson on CNN on Fox has generated a tremendous amount of attention for himself, mainly by being a lightning rod, but so too with Marine Le Pen in France, or and so on. We keep seeing this huge crisis of right-wing authoritarians using the virus and using these kinds of counter narratives of the other, like otherizing people, and using that to create fear. Do you have any thoughts about architecture and its ability to change society right now? Because I think that seems to be a subtle hint in the exhibition, but I wanted to see if you maybe want to foreground a little bit or talk a little bit more about social change and transformation through the lens of architecture.
Let me try to be specific by giving a few examples from the Biennale. We talked about refugees being away from home, but the very concept of home is changing. And it starts with the concept of property, of ownership. A very beautiful installation by the group Elemental, Alejandro Aravena from Chile, is outside in the Arsenale, made out of a series of sticks, poles that define a circle, an open space. By the way, there are a lot of circles in this Biennale. To speak about democracy, collectiveness, a lot of circles. And this circle is a very beautiful one because it is called Parley, and it's about bringing together the colonialist powers, in this case, the wood companies, the wood construction companies, and the Mapuche tribes, whose very conception of property is very different than that of the colonial powers. For a Mapuche, you don't own the land owns you. And for a colonialist, you first start by sticking your stakes in the ground and saying, this is mine. And so how do you begin to create a space for these two groups who have a very different conception of space and who owns it in terms of coming together to talk? If all goes well, they will come together and talk in Venice sometime in August about these differences among them, between them in that space, which is a provisional space defined temporarily in order to create a neutral common ground for Parley. We're not talking about conflict resolution, we're talking about Parley, the beginning of that. There's another project which is about, let me shift in scale to the scale of a house, as a project which is about a house in the backyard to densify the suburban properties. As you know, many laws in the United States are changing to create ADUs. And these ADUs are allowed to increase density, but they also plug in systematically, almost inadvertently, a very different lifestyle into the otherwise very gentrified, white, nuclear family model of living. And I think these notions, conflicting notions coexisting with each other, whether in the same space or next to each other, are going to enrich our answers to the question, how will we live together? Because coming back to the underpinning of your question, which is about the future of democracy, before it becomes a political system of representation and voting rights, etc., democracy is a way of knowing. It's an epistemology where every human experience matters. It's almost like applying scientific method to the solution of social problems. Every human being's life is an experiment which counts. And how we add them up to produce collective decisions and solutions becomes the political question. But the underlying question is a philosophical one. It's an epistemological one.
And so, I mean, if you go back to ancient Greece and the rise of democracy in places like Athens, I mean, there was other democracies, throughout Greece earlier, actually, but Athens tends to get the credit for a lot of stuff. But I love this idea of what social scientists have said, that the pandemic created a kind of not only a biological effect, but a mental pandemic as well, because people were kind of bombarded with radically different messages. They were bombarded with radically different approaches to how to solve this crisis. And some neuroscientists have been saying that we reached a crisis of social homeostasis, which to me is really fascinating. Homeostasis just means essentially finding the right balance or equilibrium, but the world is wildly out of equilibrium. And again, I keep riffing on this idea that a microorganism bought the entire capitalist structure to its needs in a very short amount of time. And it took an immigrant, like what happened with Pfizer, who was, again, Turkish-German. Which I love giving credit to that as a massive scientific breakthrough that could never have happened if they had actually turned this person away at the border. Instead they welcome in, they let them get into the education system, and they then have an incredibly powerful relationship with being a stakeholder in the society, which is, I think, from everything I've read and seen, again, I haven't physically been there because of the pandemic, but it just seems like the exhibition is really locked into that, like a heat-seeking missile. And democracy is at the core of a lot of this. I mean, that's where there's other issues where I wonder if you have anything that you felt that wasn't included, like maybe more social media or more network effect kind of approaches like artificial intelligence, generative architecture. Is there any section that you felt, given a different time, you might have taken a different path, or things that you might have wanted to include, just out of curiosity?
Yes, I do think that we did not spend enough space on the future of work. There are a few moments where that is alluded to in certain projects, both directly and indirectly. We did not have that. And I felt, I understood that to be a case in the halfway through, but I decided that I have to skip a few things. I do also think, Paul, that we could have had more monuments. However, things like the Mapuche project by Elemental brought monumentality back inadvertently. Monuments are very important in how society comes together to express certain values. But I also want to say that on the questions of diversity and equity, we approach the question from the very beginning from a different angle. It was always, for me, seen not as a space of contestation, but as a space of possibility. That we are not here to complain, but to propose alternatives. And maybe there should have been more time spent on complaining, because that is part of it. But as I mentioned, I felt like part of our responsibility as architects is to bring in certain responsible optimism, even though in certain cases it does come with a level of criticism.
Do you feel, I want to key in on a term you just said. Did you say responsible optimism or possible optimism, out of curiosity?
I think responsible, because a lot of what we put on display is not possible.
Well, I mean, okay, this is where you get to this kind of crisis of both the visible and the invisible. And in the United States, economics has been paramount, and so too in Europe, and so too with many countries right now that are recovering from the pandemic. And as far as I know, you're one of the major biennials to really have kept going and then pivoted. So that's why I think it's such an important historical kind of document of our time, and the issues that were at crisis boiling point, especially in the Western crisis of democracies. All these democracies are really being bombarded with misinformation, social media, manipulation, coercion at every level, and of course the corporate tension between biology and the sort of big pharmaceutical industry. If you look at stuff like the Sackler collection that recently has been in a huge crisis because they funded a lot of art collections, I'm trying to figure, where would you say would the takeaway be for someone walking into the exhibition? And if you had like a 15-year-old girl going, or a young person, and they magically could have Hashim Sarkis next to them saying, like an oracle descending to say, look at the show, how would you think of this in terms of millennials and post-millennials? Like, how do you feel that art and architecture can speak to that demographic right now? Because a lot of people are not traveling. They're going to see it mostly. In fact, more people will see it virtually than will see it physically, and so on and so on.
Let me share with you a few numbers. just yesterday I heard that in 2018, in the Biennale, by this date, 45,000 people visited. By this date, in the 2021 Biennale, in the current Biennale, 43,500 people visited. So the numbers are almost the same as the most visited architectural Biennale past. That bodes well, but that speaks to another level, another demographics that is changing, which is when the borders opened in Europe, everybody wanted to go to see Venice. They obviously did not have the Biennale in mind, but they wanted to see Venice before it gets flooded again with tourists. And
Right.
many of those people who came are not the mass tourists that flood Venice. And they were thirsty for cultural activities. And we were, you can say, crazy or courageous enough to dare to open that early. And it was one of the big shows that came. But obviously the title, the connection to the current situation were attractions. So that bodes very well. But the other statistic that comes from Biennale's past, Paul, is that 50% of the visitors of the Biennale are under the age of 25. And another 50%, it's not exactly the same 50, are architects and students of architecture. So it was very important for us, and for me from the very beginning, to come up with a theme, a title, a way of explaining and presenting that are about architecture reaching out to the rest of the world, and not just speaking to architecture per se. And Denali, I think, aspires to do that. There's even a section which is called How Will We Play Together, where we invited 5 architects to design a playground, so that we created a children's Biennale in the Biennale.
I love that, the Children's Biennale. I mean, especially given that how should I put this? The tension between the urban and the invisible. These are things that I think are right now front and center, especially as we move into an era sort of conditioned by 5G networks, artificial intelligence, facial recognition, all these things that are at the sort of bleeding edge of how people think about digital arts and technology. But the last major pandemic, of course, of 1918 changed the way we thought of interiors, hygiene, multi-purpose rooms, corridors, social gathering spaces. A lot of these are made into places where air circulation was paramount, and openness and access to sunlight became part of the basic fabric of how people thought of building. If you look at the crowded tenements of New York, or again, the Rua Traghetto in Venice, that sense of urban density. And even if you look at places like Kowloon City in Hong Kong, or ghettos in Mumbai or New Delhi, where the virus is spreading rapidly because of close human contact. Do you have any insights on that? These are all philosophical questions, and I want the audience to realize it's such a rare treat that you have a philosophically inclined architect who really is in the heart of these kinds of issues. So Hashim, sorry to kind of keep going back to that, but urban density is such a critical thing. Do you have any thoughts or insights or any specific parts of the exhibition that you felt dealt with that, or any of the artists or architects that you had felt challenged that as well? The playground that you just mentioned as well. By the way, Jess or Malvika or Nick, maybe you might have some more of the slides going in the background while he's speaking so people can kind of see. That would be helpful.
Paul, let me answer with a few examples here as well. The EU example by Anmahi and Winton Architects is speaking to the question of density directly. But it's also making it possible because we are willing and ready to accept other lifestyles within our mix. It would not have been possible before us being, as a new generation, able to accept this multiplicity, able to accept the fact that we do not judge another person's lifestyle, but accept it as it is. The millennials are like that. They bring their values to us in that way. They also do another thing. They think of space very differently than we do. I have to say, being a faculty member perpetually keeps my eyes open to different values and dispositions towards the world. It keeps me young, as it were. The white beard betrays all of that. But what I also want to say about the millennials is that their conception of space in terms of the relationship between the digital and the physical is not a problem. Their attitude to technology is very different. The Italian architecture scene has a very specific understanding of what technology is. It's almost foreign to architecture. They do not see it as being, it's always seen as an exterior to architecture. in this Biennale, the technology and the architecture are one and the same. Sometimes we see only what appears to be only technology, like in this image, and sometimes you don't see anything at all. And people say, well, what is this? I say, I don't know. You should ask the millennials. They are architecture to be that. We should respect and accept that. So I feel as a curator, it was very important for me to be open to those different possibilities of imagining space, where the opposites that you and I, maybe me, you're much younger than me, have no longer exist in their minds. And the emerging architecture in front of our eyes, which is biological, technological, cyborg, sci-fi, soft sci-fi, possible pop, I don't know, you see them all in front of your eyes, and I have to accept them as being possible futures or maybe possible presents that are hidden somewhere and we're elevating them.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, I mean, if anything, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to say that in asking this question and seeking innovative answers around the world, we cast the net very wide. And the average age of the Biennale participation is relatively low compared to previous ones. But the net was cast very wide to look around the world, because I truly believe that the answers, the more innovative answers, are coming from Mali, Niger, Angola, Cabo Verde, Venezuela, Beirut, places where people are beginning to confront what you saw as being the, well, as you said, being the up and coming problems, and they're facing them with their local talents and skills. The Biennale, this Biennale is no longer about Western Europe putting on display what the future of architecture is and the rest of the world coming to see it. Part of my responsibility as a Lebanese architect were to show a reverse strategy. The world is coming to Venice to show what kinds of problems and solutions Europe and the rest of the world are about to face.
Well, I mean, and you've done it in such a lyrical way. I mean, it's really, I'm sorry to keep using that word lyrical, but I feel like we're in a time where everything is quantified. I walk down the street, I measure my steps, you know, your car, your Google Map link, your Apple Maps, you name it. So we're in this era where the legible landscape is informed by mostly digital or algorithmic processes. When I say the legible landscape, meaning, say for example, the guy Noel Gordon who invented Google Maps, it's probably one of the most widely used apps for reading a landscape. Something like 2 billion people a day use it. But we're at a critical crossroads, and I think your exhibition was a lyrical attempt, not attempt, but a lyrical sort of impact on how people think about kind of how in an era where everything is relentlessly quantified, analyzed, and above all coerced, mainly by algorithmic process, it's hyper refreshing to see how you put it together. And I just deeply appreciate you making the time. By the way, speaking of time, it's 2:05. Do you have time for maybe one or two more questions for me? And then just for the Brooklyn Rail crew, do you guys, and I want to make sure we respect Jorie's time as well. So how are we for time?
There is a recurring question in your questions, which I haven't answered, which is you're noticing the lyrical in this exhibition and in how I think. But probably more a belief, a very deep belief in the need to produce beautiful objects and beautiful worlds as a form of seduction, as a form of saying it could be otherwise, rather than complete comprehensive words. And here again, I come back to Keats's notion of negative capability, that we as architects do not solve problems that, you know, we do try to improve on certain things, and that's definitely part of our mission and how people live together. But we also try to produce beautiful spaces, beautiful objects, beautiful buildings, beautiful situations where we can create alternative worlds without them being fully comprehensible or fully connected to the larger world. And in doing that, we do that like we write a poem, like we paint a painting. We enter into these worlds, each having some connection to the outside world, but they are also imagined worlds upon themselves. If you want to call that lyricism, I would take it as a beautiful compliment. I've never heard that, but I would take it definitely as a compliment. But I assume that that's what you're using as a description? Sorry.
Yeah, well, no, as a critical benchmark for how what I've seen of your work and read about, and then kind of looked on as you put together the pandemic kind of response. I was very intrigued and excited when I heard that you were curating. So I was like, that's really cool. Whoever made that, it's a great idea, a great decision. But the eerie thing about our current moment is, like, say for example, people like Robert Moses, who obviously is a deeply problematic figure. But there's a great book by Robert Caro called The Power Broker, where he breaks down that Robert Moses had more power than any elected official in New York City or the state, and was able to kind of shape and mold to detriment. Highways going across the Cross Bronx Expressway, for example, a lot of people said destroyed the fabric of the neighborhood, but allowed hip hop and other kinds of music to thrive because kids created new social spaces in the parks. And Robert Moses, obviously with the West Side Highway, that's deeply problematic. And if anybody hasn't been to the new island that Diane von Furstenberg and her husband put together, the money like something like $250 million with, it's kind of incredible tension between private space and public expression right now, especially as the pandemic is raging. So that's why I felt the biennial was a refreshing, kind of intervention in public space right now, and deeply needed because I think even right now in the US, we're having a massive debate about critical infrastructure, where it's a multi-trillion-dollar update. Bridges are crumbling, cities are heat islands. We live in the shadow of all toxic substances around us, endocrine disruptors, for example, in plastic, and the plastic gets in small chips. Your average person eats about a credit card worth of plastic every week. I was reading a really interesting article about plastic in our food chain and in the water aquifers around us. So yeah, I mean, the biennial really was deeply needed and deeply refreshing. I mean, I wish, given the circumstances, if I could fly there and hang out there for like a week or two, I would. But given America and
one of the things that we're doing, and I hope you come during those weeks, is that there will be a week every month until the closing. That's the Mapuche structure by Elemental, where we will have symposia and discussions, and the program is on the website of the Biennale. So I will be there, and hopefully we can be there together, Paul, and spend a little bit of time at the Biennale, but more time drinking and eating together.
Yeah, well, Hashim, I mean, your wake up, and especially in this 21st century, this is probably the strangest year of the strangest century in human history as the Anthropocene era rages. You're given almost like a kind of how should I put it, like a counterpoint choice, like you're choosing between for example, a virus that some epidemiologists say, okay, a pangolin kissed a bat, and magically somehow in Wuhan, in this mixed use food space, a virus magically appears. Which again, of course, we're still not clear on the origins or the genetic makeup, or for that matter, the mRNA technology that's allowed us to fight it. But all of those things have leveled this notion that architecture is no longer merely about physical space, but about the social interactions that define our relationship to those spaces. And that's where I think the strength of the biennial has really come home to roost. So I want to open up to questions because it's 2:10 and I want to respect everyone's time. And I also want to say it was refreshing to hear you talk about Keats as well. So Nick and Jess, do you guys want to help moderate the questions, or how do you guys want to do this?
That's perfect, Paul.
We'll have time for Jorie's poem.
Yeah, I definitely want to leave time for Jorie's poem as well. That's what yep.
Absolutely.
Jess,
I think our first question comes from Lynn Crawford. Lynn, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation, and it could have gone on for hours longer. I have a maybe boring but important question. When you consider constructing communities, what do you think? Do you also think about transportation out of those communities, to schools, to hospitals, to medical services, or to other places? because, you know, one of the things in America you see is this sort of urban sprawl where there's this wonderful living space, but there's no easy access outside of it. So I'm just curious about your thoughts.
Thanks. I mean, maybe I can answer it by describing the Biennale's section on communities, and it's called Emerging Communities. We decided not to call it cities or neighborhoods because I wanted us to explore other models of organization of community. And in one room, the dialogue is about how the methods of building bridges, housing, schools, create community around them. That the process of construction produces a community order, process of decision making, etc. And the connection between the building process and the governance process, or the social coming together process. The other room comes much closer to what you're asking, which is about equipping society. In America, we talk about infrastructure. In Europe, they talk about physical infrastructure, but also social infrastructure or social equipment. It's a very beautiful word used in French and Spanish, and I think in Italian, equipment. That's the schools, the hospitals, and they fall under infrastructure, perhaps because they are, for the most part of the welfare state infrastructure. And where you place these, how you place them, their architecture is very much part of the infrastructure of society. To rebuild the infrastructure of society through these institutional buildings is a very important component of social life in these countries. We tried to highlight a few examples in the United States. We highlighted a few examples on the moon. But as you said, Lynn, there's also an important dimension to this, which is not about making community claustrophobic, meaning it's your school serves the same population as your hospital, as your bridges, as everything. They are not isotropic as communities, but they are overlapping and networked. And there's a very beautiful example from Armenia about building community around after-school programs in digital learning, where these plugins happen in a kind of strategic, surgical way, not just to complement schools, but to improve on the livelihood of certain communities and their public spaces through the introduction of these small schools. So I strongly believe in what you asked about, the importance of this social equipment in improving our communities. It also makes our communities visible. It makes our communities more unified.
Thank you.
You know, Lynn, I want to respond to that just too. And Hashim, there's a famous quote from Walter Benjamin's Arcades, which I want to just intervene for just a second, and then anybody else has a question. I love this idea of we're in a dialectic here. We're in an ebb and flow. So I'm going to get into the Socratic dialectic. That's that could be a new hip hop group right there, Hashim. The Socrates crew. All right, so there's a quote from Walter Benjamin. I just want to just put out there as a little spark for a conversation here. This is from Arcades Project, and Walter Benjamin wrote, and I was thinking about your exhibition, Hashim, with this quote. Benjamin, I know he's again problematic, but a very intriguing character. He says, it's not what is past, it's not that what is past casts its light on what is present, or what is present, its light on the past. Rather, image is that wherein what has been comes together in a flash with the now to form a constellation. In other words, image is dialectics at a standstill. For while the relation of the present to the past is a purely temporal continuous one, the relation of what has been to the now is dialectical. It's not progression, but image, suddenly emergent. Only dialectical images are genuine images, that is not archaic. And the place where one encounters them is language. And I felt that that Benjamin quote really was resonant with Hashim's kind of philosophy. And I just wanted to leave that hanging in the air for a moment. But that was something I was thinking about feverishly while I was hearing Hashim talk. So I just wanted to occasionally break out into Walter Benjamin. I know it might not be the wildest thing I could be doing right now, but yeah, if anybody else has questions or comments, Hashim is a wonderfully warm-spirited person, so please feel free.
Thank you, Martin.
Wonderful. Thank you, Len, for that question. I think our next question comes from our very own Malvika Jolie. Malvika, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you, Hashim. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Can you hear me all right?
Mhm.
Yes? No? Not at all?
Come closer. Mind my ears.
A little bit? Okay, wonderful. I guess I was really moved, Hashem, by what you said about being in Lebanon and then leaving and the war going on, and so you just kept on studying, you know, doing a master's. Oh my God. Sorry, one moment. Sorry, I was really moved by what you said about, you know, estrangement. And, you know, kind of thinking of estrangement both as a position, but then as an ethic or a directional force, kind of a way of looking at the world differently. And, you know, I know Jorie Graham has thoughts on this as well, sort of what to do with grief, what to do with, you know, what happens when you're stuck in positions of pain. But I guess my question is, and this is not a curatorial question, it's a more interpersonal question, but my question is sort of how do you deal with grief or estrangement, and what kinds of sense making have you developed for those things? I feel like, you know, for some context, right, is obviously the last year has been difficult for so many people for reasons of estrangement and other. I just feel like we're seeing so much, you know, personally I'm seeing so much death unfold among my communities here and abroad. And you seem like a person who would have a sense of logics for putting together how to make sense of this sort of thing.
I'm going to try to avoid answering the question because it's extremely difficult. But on the notion of grief, I feel that I feel torn because sometimes when you're in a moment of grief, you cannot speak. Someone else has to speak on your behalf. And yet at the same time, there's no, this is where moments where language fails. And maybe poetry emerges because language fails in order to help express. But I also want to maybe soften the notion of grief by talking maybe about the dimension of your question related to this, which is the dimension of nostalgia that comes with estrangement. Even though most of my nostalgias are to places that I've never been to or moments that never were. But I do want to add to that in a way, architecture does create nostalgia and does heal nostalgia because it constructs artificial places. And in a way, such emotions never exist outside of space. Maurice Alboix has also argued that even memory does not exist outside of space. And even memory does not exist without the presence of others. And so this is where if I say I'm trying to avoid the question, I'm trying to bring it back to architecture, but trying to also say that your question is difficult because it positions the personal need for articulation and expression up front. And maybe as architects, we have been trained to oppress that because our work is not about ourselves. But when you ask an architect to speak about themselves, I think you're creating that stressful moment where we begin to realize that our forms of expression, our forms of representation are inadequate. So thank you for making it very difficult.
And by the way, Hashim and both Malvika, I mean, what's going on in India has been heartbreaking. And again, that's the crisis of governance. It's a crisis of how people relate to social space. And say, for example, the Kumbh Mela festival, the political rallies that Modi has been having. You know, it's same with Bolsonaro, same with Trump, same with Duterte. I mean, all of these right-wing authoritarian types, the sheer volume of casualties that have been caused by bad governance, and it's breathtaking.
You know, it really is, but you don't have to tell me that. You know, that can be true, and the affect of grief is also its own little thing.
Mm-hmm. No, and I was not trying in any way, shape, or form to minimize, but it's been heartbreaking to see the ways that governance can cause these kinds of crises at every level. So I hope you're in good spirits otherwise.
Thank you, Malvika and Hashim. That was a wonderfully put response about the personal need for articulation and the inadequacies that architecture to solve that personal need. Next up, we have G.E. Schwartz. You should be able to unmute.
Thank you so much. I love the Biennale. I've only been there twice, but I just love it so much. It's so important, and where we're going and where we've been. My question was, in terms of the Biennale or any other building, in general, can you talk a little bit about about the poetic dimensions, especially because it seems so often the poetic is maybe not as front and center in these discussions as it could be. But I thank you so much for anything you could offer to that.
Architecture always aspires or looks at poetry as being a field that we can emulate or learn from in one form or the other. But that's a relationship among artistic forms of expression. Where we in architecture use the notion of poetics may be very different, maybe metaphorical. But I would point to one space, and again, it's a moment rather than an overall, which is the way in which architecture can always be seen as excessive. And by that, I mean that if you want to design a door, there are certain things that can come from function, from material, from economics, but that ultimately there are other factors that nothing can decide for you, where you have to decide. And this becomes the space of, we call it design, rhetoric, personal signature. And it is in those moments where the rhetorical dimension of architecture becomes visible, where it begins to show a possibility of referring to other fields, where it can become anthropomorphic, where it can open up possibilities in many ways actually to reveal that form is excessive, and to reveal that there is no single source from which you can solve all of your problems as well. And this is a poetic dimension of architecture that I defer to people like Jorie to help us articulate it from the point of view of poetry and language as well. But I feel that that notion of poetics is very present in architecture. And the room in this Biennale called the Tectonics of Inhabitation points to that. And by tectonics, we mean the poetic dimension of technology. So there where technology is not just the thing that enables, but the thing that expresses as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, GE. And I believe next, one of our last questions is from Michael, who has something to say about John Keats. And you should be able to unmute your mic.
Okay, I'm unmuted. It's more, I mean, I just put it in the chat, so for press for time, people can read it in the chat. But it was, as they say, it was worth the price of admission today just to hear someone apply John Keats' theory of negative capability to a field outside of art. John Keats, I believe, would just love that this has found an application for something, for a medium, a field outside of the art. So I congratulate you on that. And as I said, I'm delighting in that. It was wonderfully unexpected. Thank you.
Thank you for noticing that. I can share with you anecdotally for the first time that when I was invited by the president of the Biennale, former president Paulo Barata, to meet with him in Rome, where he offered me to curate this Biennale, the first thing I did, he asked me, where are you going now? We were in front of the Pantheon. I said, I'm going to the Cattolica to visit the grave of John Keats. So that's the first thing I did after I became curator.
That's so sweet.
That's that is
And I
beautiful.
guess, and I guess you went to the foot of the Spanish Steps.
Yeah, there I've been before, but I never managed to make it to the grave.
Oh,
And
well,
finally,
great.
and Shelley's grave as well, and many others. It's not easy to call a graveyard beautiful, but that one is especially beautiful. And I love the name, the Ac Católica, where everyone who's not Catholic gets buried.
That's a wonderful anecdote. Thank you, Hashim. Last but certainly not least, we have a question from Fong Bui, our publisher and artistic director at The Rail. Fong, you should be able to.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Hashim. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul, for this wonderful conversation back and forth. I was able to listen to most of it. I had to attend to one meeting, but it's just terrific what you've been saying, and I couldn't help. Of course, John Kidd's negative capability is essentially a haiku manifesto of the rail, you know, Hashim. I mean, this is the artist's function.
I did not know, but
yes, indeed. It's like Hannah Arendt's great term, thinking without the banister is a similar application in some way there. But I just realized that the notion of utopia, because, you know, one of my very closest friends, Hashim, was the great Raymond Abraham. And we used to argue almost to physical fight at times. And it's very intense friendship for nearly 2 decades. And we argue about everything, not just architecture, but philosophy and psychologies and politics and whatnot. But I always admire his principle that Raymond always insisted on utopian, the idea utopia. We used to argue about this because the fact that Levittown, whatever fell in Soviet Union, you know, we know about constructivism, and it ended, it got planted here in America too. It's super close between communism and capitalism. Just take, for example, CIA that was created in September 1947, which a month after the first suburb America was invented, Levittown, 1947. So I was thinking about this in reference to utopia itself as a concept, you know, and I just can't help but think of what utopia is not approach to the real world, even though actual political social order, it exists at no moment in time and at no point in space, is nowhere. But just as a conception of a nowhere has stood for the test and proved its strength in the development of modern world, it allowed from the nature of the character of ethical thought, which is you've been talking about with Paul here, it can never condescend to accept the given. The ethical world is never given, it is forever in the making. I think I'm paraphrasing Ernst Cassirer, more or less, but I can't help also thinking of in the art world, you know, Paul, taken back, for example, this is remembering what Eric Fisher, the painter, who wrote in response to the late art historian, our beloved Irving Sandler, I think it was in Real and Opinion in 2007, where he said that in the 50s, the critic was important. They were the middle person, middleman, you know, they mediate for the artist and the art world. And then mid-60s to the 70s, the museum became the predominant central position where artists began making work that for the museum, like earthworks, like site-specific works, and even conceptual art. So the museum played a huge part of that decade and a half. And then when the 80s came, pluralism exploded. A huge sense, you know, no curators, no critics, no gallery can even keep up with the pace, with the explosion, you know. And artists, meanwhile, and architects, both were made as celebrities. It makes sense. And then the 90s, you know, the gallery began catching up a bit and figured out a way how to package all this explosion, especially in diversities, in regard to the issue of diversity. And then the first decade, 2000, you know, we begin to experience this amazing influx of uneducated consumer, unthoughtful, unsophisticated viewer. I mean, this is what we face in reality. So my question is very simple. As museum began to play a central role, in other words, there's a great need for architects everywhere, Hashim, you know, and how much would that now fit into this desire, this incredible, you know, request? I mean, until up to the pandemic, we have heard so many museums to be built in China, in Korea, in India, and elsewhere, even Latin America and elsewhere. So now that you have come to this amazing, important curation, how does that reassess in your overall view of it?
Thanks for pointing this out. Let me say outright about Raymond Abraham that he was a very important voice in architecture wherever he landed, particularly because he was dissonant. He was not speaking with the rest. He was always speaking from a different perspective. And in doing that, and in taking on the role of the importance of utopias or visionary architectures, he was always creating tensions, very productive tensions, wherever he landed, by showing that architecture cannot just live and breathe on its practical dimensions, but it has other resources, has other assets, the visionary asset of itself, that are so necessary in order to make the other forms of architecture better. And so that role of an antagonist-protagonist was a very important one that he played so well everywhere. And I'm glad he played it in your friendship as well. What I wanted to respond to in relation to the museum, the proliferation of museums is definitely a question that is on our minds, but so is the proliferation of biennales. But as I started curating the Biennale, I realized a couple of things. First of all, it's very difficult to think of architecture inside the museum. Architecture is the museum itself, not the inside of the museum being about displaying architecture. It's very difficult to display architecture. The conventional sense of architecture, of models, drawings, etc., is how we think about it, as an allographic art, as Nelson Goodman described it, meaning an art that is made through its representations, but particularly because it's expensive. But when you start thinking about architecture being inside the museum, being on display, that's where many of the challenges begin to happen. And that's why the Arsenale comes to the rescue, because the Arsenale is so big, you can actually pull in the architecture inside it as one-to-one representations. But also, I think what I mentioned earlier about the pandemic as elevating the need of the installation, of the experiential installation, because yes, you can see architecture digitally on your screen everywhere you go, but it's not going to be possible to experience the projects that we have on display, even the way their digital component is experienced. There are very strong sound, olfactory, experiential dimensions to this Biennale that were very important for us to turn exhibition of architecture into something else, something that is meta architecture, or an installation that replicates architecture without replicating the built form, the experience of architecture. But I also discovered another thing, which is when you curate the Biennale, it's very different than curating an exhibition. You create an exhibition by being very particular, very specific, very organized, so that your message carries across. But maybe because it was an open question, but I wanted to make sure that my hand in curating this exhibition was open and also invisible, because you want to make sure that you allow a multiplicity of voices to be present, that you do not channel them, but that you create dialogues between them. As a of the Denali, you're basically responsible for cutting a section through the moment you're in, creating something like a time capsule but at the same time saying, I believe that this will be the future, the near future, at the same time. So how to do all of that without being imposing was my challenge in curating the Biennale. And I here emphasize that it's very different than curating a museum exhibition.
Well, thank you, Hashim. Even Raymond always insisted, even the unbuildable need to materialize and live through a drawing. So here is one of many in my collection. Can you see it?
The reflection is, let me make it bigger.
Yeah, there's a light reflection on it.
Yeah.
What is it? Okay.
It's one of those buildings that he made to drawing through from which will never get built, you know, Paul? He's famous.
Okay.
Next time you come to New York, please come. I'll show you more of Raymond's work.
Big pleasure. Big pleasure.
Thank you so much. And
so, by the way, Fong, I just want to make sure to tie things together a little bit. And Hashim, Fong, the drawings and stuff, Fong's drawings are really wonderful. They're kind of like what I call social portraits, sort of a moment of, or an instance of engagement that Fong does. And he has a whole series that they're quite compelling. It's really fun stuff. Fong, I wanted to just mention tiny tie-in, and then I guess Jess and Malvika and Nick, if we want to get Jorie ready. To me, at least, the thread that connects what Fong was just talking about with this idea of the unbuildable. Right now, I mean, there's a very famous poem. We keep talking about the poem, Poetic Dimension of Architecture. I think that's going to be the reframe for this conversation. But you know, so imagine, you know, with Frost's poem, the path less, or the road less taken or not traveled. Imagine if you have that choice of the different paths you can choose, whether you curate, whether you put an object in an exhibition, whether you go to a physical building, or whether you have an imaginary space. That process of selection is what creates the pattern of choice. And I think that's what buildings, at least if I was to do my take on Hashim's, his kind of take, and I'm so, again, just very happy to have his thoughts on this, is like how we think about potentialities right now in an era where capitalism has given us this notion of expansion without end, of you know, post-scarcity, of always having more and more and more. And then of course the casualties of that are the actual biome systems, the ecosystems, biodynamic engagement with the landscapes around us, and the sort of the Anthropocene as the sort of the edge of human experience on planet Earth after, you know, only a couple 100,000 years. This is what, you know, if aliens came down and saw the ruins of our civilization, most of it would be plastic at this point, you know, just like, so Hashim, I mean, just by way of closing, and then maybe pass the torch to Jorie, do you have any closing thoughts on the near future of biennials? Because I mean, someone like Christiane Paul at the Whitney Biennial, for example, she's been doing an algorithmic biennial that generates and selects artists algorithmically, where they're tagged, and you can just have a generative biennial that literally is taking the concept of the biennial and making a formula out of it. Things like that. I mean, probably that's totally remote to your style. But I wanted to just see if you have any closing thoughts, and then we could just pass the mic to Jorie.
I come back to your quote from Benjamin, and something that struck me there in terms of the dialectic dimension that you were talking about between present and past and future, is that architecture has a difficult relationship with time, but also a difficult relationship with being about one thing, or about allowing one thing to happen and only one thing. I think it was William Faulkner who talked about architecture as being the furniture of time, and Kenneth Frampton talking about architecture as being anachronistic. That, I think they both meant that, you know, you build it for one thing and it stays, it becomes something else, and we have to be responsible for that. We need to think about what that means, both in terms of the environmental impact, and that is becoming more and more an issue, on how we project our own ambitions on the future generations, and they don't match them, let alone they might represent only their disappointment with our own ambitions. And yet, architecture has a possibility of anticipating possibilities without imposing them, inspiring uses without dictating them. Mm-hmm. This is to Frampton's notion that architecture is anachronistic. I would say that architecture is strategically anachronistic rather than by nature anachronistic. And that as we anticipate futures, we want to make sure that we are not presenting dated architectures or architectures that impose on future generations futures that we do not want. And yet at the same time, we know that in the same dining room, as the adults are having food around the table, following the social decorum of what does it mean to have a conversation and how to eat and how to pass the food, the children are hanging out underneath the table, creating their own completely different space, playing, inventing other possibilities of what that dining room could be. And those simultaneities of space defy the idea that architecture is about one thing, or that it allows one thing to happen. You can be in a public space where two people are making love on a bench, whereas in the other corner, people are demonstrating. We need to be attentive to that superpower that architecture carries in it, the idea of simultaneity of possibilities, both within the present and between now and the future.
That sounds like a perfect segue to our long-awaited poetry reading. At The Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and I am thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the day, Jorie Graham, to the stage. A few words about Jorie, one of the most celebrated poets of the American post-war generation. Jorie Graham is the author of numerous collections of poetry, including Hybrids of Plants and Ghosts from 1980, Erosion 1983, The End of Beauty 1987, and many, many others. She won the Pulitzer for Poetry with The Dream of the Unified Field, selected poems. And she has taught for many years at Harvard University as the Boylston Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory, the first woman to be given this position. Jorie, take it away.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Really? There are so many things. I ended up changing my mind during the conversation about whether to read poems about artificial intelligence or migration or every other topic that you covered, the visible, the invisible, the idea, the abandonment of work, the abandonment of the opportunity to work. So I just overlap with many of your concerns. Oh my God, what did you do here? I don't want to see myself this way. Gallery, there you go. Thank you. I'm just going to read one poem, and I'm going to take off from a couple of things that Paul was saying at the end and Hashim was saying at the end. One is in the Anthropocene, the point that we've gotten to, which is one thing that we sort of implied a lot but didn't mention, which is that it takes about, I think, 8 planets to sustain the amount of people living on it now. And we haven't really solved the sustainability problem, which of course is just one of the many things putting pressure on what will be inevitable migrations. So the idea of becoming inherently nomadic in some way in the way we live, in order to be able to live in an enforced, perhaps nomadic culture is very interesting to me. You all mentioned Keats repeatedly, and I mentioned negative capability. And when you went to that cemetery in Rome, of course, what it says on his grave is, "Here lies one whose name is writ on water." And that feeling of being someone who can both disappear and yet be so present is part of what's built into a lot of the ambitions of the architecture you're describing, the kind of no footprint, sort of like the invisible, when Paul said at the very beginning, the dematerialization of the sublime, that idea of the ways in which we are going to thin out our presence, or nature will make sure that we do, and probably it's going to be the latter, because as we prepare for Glasgow, one of the really sad things that's happening is there's going to be no possibility of remaining under 2 degrees. So making the architecture for above 2 degrees is a really astonishing challenge. One of the other things that's interesting about what you talked about and looking at those amazing images of Venice is how many networks, how many nets and nettings and networks are formal properties that seem to work. So they both go back to some of the things that Paul also said, the visibility of the network and the invisibility of the network, and the ways in which we have to live together in a kind of network that functions, those incredible vertical lines you had where people could live with migrants living, inhabiting, cohabiting in spaces with them as kinds of networks, and yet the constant referencing the network of intelligence that we hope will manage to find a way to get us out of this. And finally, when he does talk about negative capability, he talks about being capable of dwelling in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without irritable reaching after fact and reason. So it's a kind of lifting off of one into the above and off of the materiality of the conceptual intellect, and assuming that there'll be an information that will come at one as if, by invisible means that is more materially satisfying than the literal material. Again, I thought the dematerialization of the sublime was a wonderful term for that. Anyway, I'm going to read an older poem, my last few books. The most recent one is called Runaway, and the one before is called Fast. So obviously I've been dealing with post-human conditions, accelerationism, and all the things that you've been talking about. This one, I think the word imagination is the word you use the most. You kind of used it interchangeably with poetic. And so I thought I'd read this poem in which an active imagination is threefold. One of the things I think that's most important, and it's built into the Biennale, into all the structures that I could tell that you were giving us images of and you were discussing, Hashim, is the attempt to understand that one is a species among other species, and to feel the presence of other species, and to understand that it's not in a hierarchical way the way we have traditionally, but really in a very new horizontal way, to sort of become porous to the presence of other species, and to understand that the imagination has to be capable of feeling its way to other forms of consciousness than anthropocentric human consciousness, or we're not going to be able to survive. It's because we have to gather some of our intelligence, some of our instincts from the non-human, not just the artificially non-human, but the also species non-human. So this is a poem which involves the networks. It was written, it involves surveillance networks, and it involves one of the other things that Paul mentioned was in terms of abundance and scarcity and greed. It involves the astonishing overfishing that we are doing and the destruction of the sea floor. And it attempts to merge in the beginning deep water trawling, which is sort of the indiscriminate fishing that we do, on sort of a runaway greed model, not even knowing why we do it anymore. It's not even a necessary way of, and indiscriminate surveillance. It astonished me when Snowden revealed that those cables that carry the surveillance from the US to which I thought were going to be through the air. I'm sure most of you probably thought so too, that there are literally big fat cables running along the ocean floor from the United States to Great Britain, which are carrying the surveillance information, which is kind of so literal and astonishing. So those two things merge in the beginning of the poem, and it's not a long poem, but in the second half of the poem, there's an attempt to speak from a non-human position. Obviously one can't, but it's an active imagination. It's a practice, and it's, I think, a very lucrative practice spiritually, morally, in terms of the imagination right now. Just try to figure out if the imagination can go there. Deep water trawling. And plastic creates what are called hypoxic zones, which is where there's no more oxygen in the water. There are huge amounts of our ocean not currently like that. Deep water trawling. The blades like irises turning very fast to see you completely. Steel blue, then red where the cut occurs. The cut of you. They don't want to know you, they want to own you. No, not own. We all mean to live to the end. Am I human? We don't know that. Just because I have this way of transmitting, call it voice, a threat, communal, actually. The pelagic midwater nets like walls closing round us, starting in the far distance where they just look to us like distance, distance coming closer. Hear it, eliminating background, is all foreground, you in it, the only ground, not even punishment, trawling nets, bycatch, poison, ghost fishing, the coil of the listening along the very bottom, the nets weighed down with ballast, raking the bottom looking for nothing, indiscriminate. There is nothing in particular you want. You just want. You just want to close the third dimension, to get something which is all, becomes all. Once you are indiscriminate, discards can reach 90% of the catch. Am I, the habitat crushed and flattened, net of your listening and my speaking, we can no longer tell them apart. The atmosphere between us turbid, no place to hide, no place to rest. You need to rest. There is nature, it is the rest. What is not hunting is illustration. Not regulated, are you? Probing down to my greatest depths, 2,000 meters and more. Despite complete darkness that surrounds me, despite my being in my place under strong pressure, along with all my hundreds of species, detritus, in extreme conditions. Deep water fish grow very slowly, very, so have long life expectancy, late reproductive age, are particularly thus vulnerable. It comes along the floor under the underwater mountains, scraping the steep slopes. What is bycatch? Hitting the wrong target, the wrong size, not eaten, for which there is no market, banned, endangered, such as birds, sometimes just too much, no more space on the boat, millions of tons thrown back dead or wounded, the scars on the seabed, the mouth the size of a football field. And if there is no one, there is still ghost fishing, nets abandoned in the sea that continue through centuries to catch, mammals, fish, shellfish. We die of exhaustion or suffocation. The synthetic materials last forever. Ask us anything. How deep is the sea? You couldn't go down there. Pressure would crush you. Light disappears at 6,000 feet. Ask another question. Can you hear me? No. Who are you? I am. Did you ever kill a fish? I was once, but now I am human. I have imagination. I want to love. I have self-interest. Things are not me. Do you have another question? I am haunted, but by what? Human supremacy, the work of humiliation, the pungency of the pesticide. What else? The hammer that comes down on the head, knocks the eyes out. I was very lucky. The end of the world had already occurred. How long ago was that? I don't know. It's not a function of knowledge. It is in a special sense that the world ends. You have to keep living. You have to make it not become waiting. Nothing is disturbingly visible. Only the outside continues, but it continues. So you have to find a way to make the inside continue. Your entity is fragile. You are an object you own. At least you were given it to own. You have to figure out what ownership is. You thought you knew. You were wrong. It was wrong. There was wrongness in the mix. It turns out you are a first impression. Years go by. Imagine that. And there is still a speaker. There will always be a speaker. In the hypoxic zones is almost no more oxygen. Then there is no more oxygen, for real. Picture that, says the speaker. Who are you? Where are you? Going down into the dead zones, water not water. The deeper you go, he says, the scarier it gets, because there's nothing there. There are no fish, no organisms alive, no life. So it's just us. Dead zones, bigger than the Sahara, he says. The largest lifeless spaces this side of the moon, he says. She says, who is this speaking to me? I am the upwelling. I am the disappearing. Hold on. Just a minute, please. Hold on. There is a call for you.
Wow, thank you so much, Jorie. That was really special, and it is always such a treat to hear you read. And thank you, Hashim. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to everyone who tuned in today and for all of your questions. Join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a radical poetry reading curated by Yohan Noel, featuring readings by Latasha and Nevada Diggs, Joey De Jesus, Yara Lisiaga Rojas, and Ronaldo V. Wilson. You can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave.
Bye. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hashim. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you,
so much,
Jorie. That
Jorie.
was beautiful.
Sorry. What
Thank you,
a
Jorie.
read
Thanks,
it.
Paul.
A wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
hopefully we'll get some food in Venice.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Muchas
Thank
gracias.
you. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much for the
Thanks, everyone.
reading, Jory. The reading was
Thank you, Jorie.
beautiful too. Wow.
Thank you. Thank you, John
Keats.
Keats.